Most of us here are or have been concerned about environmental trends. Indeed, we look at the world and we see shrinking forests, expanding deserts, falling water tables, collapsing fisheries, rising temperature, ice melting, rising seas, disappearing species. You can go through the list. And many of us who are here, almost by definition, are convinced we have to make some major changes in the world. We know, in looking back at earlier civilizations that got into environmental trouble, that some of them were able to make course corrections and stabilize things. Others were not. And we study their archaeological sites today. Those who've not been convinced yet by environmental trends of the need to restructure the global economy, I think will be convinced by what's happening in China. Almost ever since we can remember, we have been saying that the United States, with 5% of the world's people, consumes a third or 40% of the Earth's resources. That was true. It is no longer true. Today, China consumes more of most basic resources than the United States. Grain, meat, oil, coal, steel. Of those, we now lead only in the consumption of oil. Meat consumption in China is nearly double that in this country. Steel consumption in China is 3 times what it is here. Now that China has overtaken us in the consumption of most basic resources, we can ask the next question, which is, what happens if China catches up to us in consumption per person? If the Chinese economy grows at 8% a year, down from the 9 to 10% of recent years, then by 2031, income per person in China will be the same as in the United States today. If we assume that they will spend their money more or less as we do, that they consume as much paper per person as we do, for example, then China's 1.45 billion people in 2031 will be consuming twice as much paper as the world currently produces. There go the Earth's forests. Or consider a China with 3 cars for every 4 people, as we now have. China would have a fleet of 1.1 billion cars. They'd have to pave an area, roads, highways, parking lots, comparable to the area now planted in rice. They would need 99 million barrels of oil a day. The world is currently producing 84 million barrels a day and may never produce much more than that. What China is teaching us is that the Western economic model, the fossil fuel-based, automobile-centered, throwaway economy, is not going to work for China. If it doesn't work for China, it will not work for India, which by 2031 may have an even larger population than China. Nor will it work for the other 3 billion people in the developing countries who are also dreaming the American dream. And in a world that's flat, in a world that is increasingly integrated economically, where we all depend on the same oil, grain, steel, it's not going to work for us either. This analysis of China as a consuming country, 2 pages in Chapter 1, is probably has had the greatest impact of anything in Plan B 2.0. Once you go through this exercise, it's very difficult to say, oh, don't worry, things are going to be fine. The market will take care of it. We either will have to change direction, or things will eventually begin to unravel, because I've just been talking about China, not the world and its claims on the Earth's resources. The new economy will be powered largely by renewable sources of energy. Tom is right. This is where the jobs are. This is where the investment's going to be. The new economy will have a much more diverse transportation system. It will not be so heavily dependent on automobiles. And it will reuse everything. Will McDonough says. Waste is the product of poor design. He's right. The exciting thing is we have the technologies to build the new economy, and we can see glimpses of the new economy emerging here and there around the world. We see it in the wind farms of Western Europe, where wind-generated electricity now satisfies the residential needs of 40 million Europeans. By 2020, it should be close to 200 million, half of Europe's residential electricity coming from wind farms. We see it in the solar rooftops of Japan. We see it in the growing fleet of hybrid cars in the United States. We see it in the geothermally heated homes of Iceland. 93% of all homes in Iceland are now heated with geothermal energy. They don't have to import fuel oil for heating. We see it in the bicycle-friendly streets of Amsterdam and Copenhagen, where 35% or more of all trips are taken by bicycle. Partly inspired by Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, I began looking again at some of the earlier civilizations as I was researching and writing Plan B 2.0, and I've continued to look at this and asked myself, now which indicators should they have been looking at? The Sumerians, for example, or the Mayans. The Sumerians, it's clear it was the rising water table led to the desalting and the collapse of their food system. With the Mayans, it was deforestation, soil erosion, again, the collapse of the food system. And I asked myself, if I were to pick one indicator now to look at as one that's going to tell us something about our future, what would it be? One environmental or one economic indicator? And I think it would be the price of oil. We are an oil-based civilization. Oil is a depletable resource. It is being depleted. And while we have long been concerned about the effect of rising oil prices on food production costs, it now appears that the effect of rising oil prices on the demand for agricultural commodities to convert into automotive fuel is going to have a far greater effect. It turns out that almost all our food commodities, wheat, corn, rice, soybeans, sugarcane, almost everything we eat can be converted into fuel for cars. And at one time, up until a year or two ago, biofuel programs were controlled by governments because they were dependent on subsidies, and these had to go through the fiscal process each year. So governments controlled them. But what's happened now is that governments have lost control because the investment in ethanol distilleries in the United States, for example, is being driven by the runaway price of oil. No one is in charge. And interestingly, the licensing of ethanol distilleries takes place at the state level. So throughout the Corn Belt, state governments and governors are very excited about getting as much investment as they can in ethanol distilleries. But the scary thing is that no one in Washington is in charge. No one is looking at the grain required for food processing, the grain required for feed, our export commitments that we've been working hard to build over the years, and what's going to be needed to operate the ethanol distilleries. Let me give you one sort of dramatic example of this. An economist at Iowa State, Bob Wiesner, W-I-S-N-E-R, has been tracking the number of ethanol distilleries in operation in Iowa, the number under construction, and the number that have been announced that are in the planning stages. He says if they are all built, they will require 2.3 billion bushels of corn. Iowa produces 2.1 billion bushels of corn. Imagine the headline. Iowa becomes leading world corn importer. I mean, Iowa is our biggest corn producing state. South Dakota in a very similar situation. Other states not quite that far along, but probably close to half of the corn produced in Minnesota, for example, will shortly be going into ethanol distilleries. Malaysia. Tom wrote a a neat column on Brazil and ethanol distilleries there, and that's now supply 40% using sugarcane, very efficient, supply 40% of the automotive fuel in Brazil. Now, that's a little easier for them because their automotive fuel consumption, as I recall, is about 1/20th of ours, maybe 1/15th. So, or almost all the countries in Europe now building ethanol distilleries and biodiesel refineries. Malaysia, a year and a half ago, had no biofuel program at all. They have now licensed 52 biodiesel refineries to use palm oil, which they want to export as fuel because it's more valuable than exporting the crude palm oil. I could go down the list, but what's happening is we're seeing the competition beginning to develop between the 800 million people in the world who own automobiles and want to sustain their mobility and the 2 billion poorest people in the world, many of whom are spending half or more of their income on food for the same commodities. And just as there's no one in charge in the United States who's sort of keeping a balance sheet and seeing where we are, there's no agency at the international level that has the responsibility for mediating this emerging competition between automobiles and low-income people for the same food commodities. So we're moving into a situation where we're facing a social and a political problem unlike any we've faced before. And one gets the sort of sinking feeling that in the US no one's in charge, and at the global level no one's in charge. Almost everyone, almost all governments are very pro-biofuel that have the capacity to produce them. Now, the risk here is that the share of the world's agricultural supplies, and incidentally, the demand for automotive fuels is essentially insatiable as far as agriculture is concerned. If we convert the entire US grain harvest into ethanol, it will satisfy maybe 16% of our automotive fuel needs. Or consider this, the grain required to fill a 25-gallon SUV tank with ethanol will feed one person for a year. There are limits to how far we can go down this road, but we haven't really come to terms with this yet. It's going to emerge as a major issue, could divide the world into two camps, those countries that benefit from producing biofuels and those that suffer from it. But there's no one in charge. The risk is that rising food prices could lead to political instability in low-income countries on a scale that could disrupt global economic progress. Think of some of the vulnerable countries that import a fair amount of grain. Indonesia, Nigeria, Mexico, for example, and scores of other countries. But it's an entirely new issue, and I don't think I can overemphasize the importance of addressing it sooner rather than later. There is, fortunately, and excitingly, an alternative. In this country, if we decided for oil security reasons, as Tom was discussing, for climate stabilization reasons, for reduction of our fiscal, of our trade deficit, that we wanted to cut oil use quickly, we could easily reduce gasoline use in half in this country over the next decade simply by shifting entirely to gas-electric hybrids. Consider that last year, the average car, this is using the EPA ratings that tend to overstate, but the average car sold last year got 22 miles per gallon. The Toyota Prius, the most popular of the hybrids, got 55 miles per gallon. Now, that's a huge difference. But if we shift to gas-electric hybrids, that opens another option. Because if you take a Prius, for example, and add a second storage battery and a plug-in capacity, then we can do our short-distance driving with electricity. Plug it in and recharge it at night while we're sleeping, and when the electricity is cheap. We can do the commuting, grocery shopping, etc., almost entirely with electricity. If at the same time we're making that shift, we invest not in hundreds of wind farms, but thousands of wind farms across the country feeding cheap electricity into the grid, we're running our cars largely on wind energy. with technologies now on the market. We don't have to wait 20 years for some new technology to develop. This is exciting. And the cost of wind-generated electricity to run cars would be less than the equivalent of $1 a gallon gasoline. What are we waiting for? The key in restructuring the global economy is to get the market to tell the truth. We are all economic decision makers. As consumers, as corporate planners, as government policymakers, as investment bankers. And as economic decision makers, we rely on the market for guidance. We rely on prices. The problem is the market is omitting many prices. When we buy a gallon of gasoline, we pay less than $3 a gallon. But most of that $3 is the cost of getting the oil out of the ground, refining in the gasoline, getting the gasoline to the local service station. We do not include in that the cost of treating respiratory illnesses from breathing polluted air, damage from acid rain, or certainly not the disruption of climate change. If we include all those costs, and there are a number of studies out there now, then we should be paying more like $10 a gallon for gasoline than $3 a gallon. And the way to do that, way to incorporate those indirect costs is to restructure the tax system. Lower income taxes, raise energy taxes. A carbon tax, for example. Sweden is doing that. They're in the process. In the middle of a 10-year effort to substantially reduce income taxes and raise energy taxes. No change in the level of taxation. We're not talking about adding any new taxes. Just change the structure of the tax system to get it to tell the environmental truth. Øystein Dale, Norwegian, former vice president of Exxon for Norway and the North Sea, said after the collapse of the Soviet Union back in the early 90s, he said, socialism collapsed because it did not allow the market to tell the economic truth. Capitalism may collapse because it does not allow the market to tell the ecological truth. That's in the last chapter of Plan B 2.0. A couple of wrap-up points. One, how much... The question one of the questions I'm frequently asked is, how much time do we have? And the answer is, I don't know, nor does anyone else. We've been talking about climate change. And we know there are certain thresholds somewhere, thresholds of irreversibility where things will reach a point where we won't be able to get back. Where are they? We don't know. Nature determines those thresholds. Nature is the timekeeper here, and we can't see the clock. So we don't know how much time we have left. But the growing sense within the scientific community, whether it's methane hydrates, as Stuart mentioned, or the melting of the ice, Greenland ice sheet, for example, there's a real sense that time could be running out. The good news is that social change comes very quickly sometimes. When the Berlin Wall came down, it was not widely anticipated or projected, but it was a visual manifestation of a political revolution in Eastern Europe. Total change in the political landscape, an essentially bloodless political revolution. I can recall December 1941. If at the beginning of December you'd conducted a poll with the American people and said, do you think we should get involved in the war or not? Probably 95%. Then came Pearl Harbor, December 7th. Everything changed. That ratio flipped. January 6, 1942, President Roosevelt gave a State of the Union address. He said, we're going to produce 45,000 tanks, 60,000 planes, 20,000 artillery guns, 6 million tons of shipping. Logistical challenge, enormous, fighting two wars on the far side of two oceans. No one had ever seen numbers like this before. But what he and his colleagues realized was that the largest concentration of industrial power in the world at that time was in the U.S. automobile industry. Because even during the Depression, we were producing 2 or 3 million cars a year. So after he gave his State of the Union address, he called in the leaders of the automobile industry, and he said, because you guys represent such a large share of our industrial capacity, we're going to depend heavily on you to help us reach these goals. And they said, Mr. President, we're going to do everything we can, but producing cars and all these arms is going to be a real stretch. He said, you don't understand. We're going to ban the sale of private automobiles in the United States. He didn't say go shopping. He said, we're going to ban the sale of private automobiles in the United States. And from the beginning of April 1942 until the end of 1944, there were essentially no cars produced in the United States. We totally restructured the U.S. industrial economy, not in decades, not in years, but in a matter of months. And I think back to that when I look at the restructuring we have to do in the energy economy. If we got really serious, we can make things happen very, very fast. And my final point is that we've heard the term saving the planet. What we're really talking about is saving civilization. I think our civilization is in trouble. And I don't think we have a lot of time to turn things around. But fortunately, if we get our act together, it doesn't take much time. And almost all of us are doing things. We work with companies or as individuals making lifestyle adjustments that make us feel better, that make companies feel better. But we've got to change the system. We've got to get the market to tell the ecological truth. If we can do that, we can restructure the economy, and we can do it quickly. We all have to become politically active. Get involved in the campaigns. We've got an election coming up. Look for the candidates who are supporting action on these environmental issues. It means being continually active. Get people together in your congressional district who share your concern on these issues, and meet with your congressperson or your senator when they're back home. These are the kinds of things we've got to do. We've got to let them know we're concerned. The most exciting thing I see in the country today is a very rapidly rising level of concern about these issues, especially climate change. We can make the change. We've done it before. Thank you very much.